Okay, so hello everybody. So welcome to the USC Architecture Research Seminar Series. So I believe that many of us may have some tired and stressed at this pandemic season. So I always hope you stay healthy and also productive this semester. So before we start, so I have a couple of announcements. So the university allowing the field and community-based research that may need a site visit or the human subject test of the campus. So updated guidelines are applied to such a research project. So if there is any faculty who plan to do field-based research, yeah, please let us know. By the way, my name is Juno Choi. Oh yeah, sure, that's Sascha.
I want to do field research, but
okay, great.
In LA.
Yeah. Yeah, so the approval procedure very simple. So I intentionally make it like that way. So if you have any human subject experiment, you need some IRB. But if you are not familiar with that process, just check with me. Okay. Yeah. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Juno Choi. I'm the associate dean for research and creative work, and also associate professor in the School of Architecture at USC. So yeah. So actually, yeah, today we will have the third seminar series in this semester. So with Dr. Delz. So next our research seminar will be on October 19th, so which is Monday. So we will have a Professor Erica Cochran, the professor and director of the Center for Building Performance and Diagnostics in the School of Architecture at the Carnegie Mellon University. So she will share her center's research activity and also recent study outcomes related with the environmental comfort, net zero energy building, and also human factors. So I hope many of you can attend the seminar to get some good information from Dr. Erica Cochran. Okay. Okay. So today, sorry. Yeah, today. Sorry about that. Just a second. Yes, the screen is a bit weird. Okay. Okay, so today we have Dr. Sascha Delz. So he's an assistant professor of School of Architecture at USC. So he's also an architect and researcher working at the intersection of architecture, urban design, and urban studies. So he holds a master's degree in architecture and doctoral science from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich. So his research focuses on how specific political economic frameworks influence the manifestation of architecture, urban form, and living environment, and engaging with the contemporary urbanization processes. So he is particularly interested in advancing knowledge on more equitable and collaborative practices of urban production, as well as non-profit model of adequate and affordable housing. So here present about one of his recent research focusing on the spatial formation and design. So his talk is for 45 minutes, and after that we will have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&As. So if you have any question, so yeah, please hold the question until his talk, and then after his talk finished, you can ask him directly in person, through Zoom here. Okay, yeah, please join me to welcome Dr. Delz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Chunho, for the introduction, and Kay for the organization. I'm very happy to be here and share a little bit of my research experience and my research project. Let me share my screen. Can you see, everybody see it? All right, so The reason why I call this investigating spatial transformations beyond scalar and disciplinary boundaries is that as an architect and designer, when I went into a research mode for my PhD, I often received or I experienced kind of difficulties in placing myself, what I'm actually doing. Investigating spatial transformations is kind of a thing that is by design somewhere in the middle of everything in terms of disciplines and also approaches and methodologies. So I would like to talk about today a little bit about how I perceive that, and that there's actually, I think, a way forward, or actually an interesting and relevant reason why this could be a good thing to be in between chairs and disciplines. And I will mainly talk about this reflecting on my PhD work that I did on Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, and its specific aspects of urban transformation that happened over the last 20 years in the city. So investigating spatial transformations basically means doing something almost impossible, the complexity of things happening, why things change spatially and incrementally or very quickly, involves a lot of different things. You can see here an image of normal everyday dwellings in Addis Ababa in the front that are having been replaced overnight sometimes by structures that you can see in the background. This happens very quickly, very obviously, but there's a lot of things happening between that, and it's usually not very easy to find just one explanation. So I think it's important to see that we look at different ways how we can open up our ways to investigate these things, not stick to just one theory or one method or one methodology, and maybe even starting to mix things if it's possible. Here's a quote by Neil Brenner, who talks about this ambition on a theoretical level, where he says that it's basically it would be unjust or simply not feasible to think just in simple frameworks or linear frameworks. Of course, this also involves disciplinary and scalar issues of like skipping, or like I said, being placed somewhere in between things. We are not sure what we are sometimes. Are we social scientists? Are we engineers? Are we designers? A lot of these disciplines have very strong frameworks and methodologies that they apply to their research. But when we are faced with things like this, or what you can see on this image, it's almost impossible, or at least I found it impossible, to find just one aspect of how could you go about this. This is basically our data. You know, when a scientist or an engineer comes with a data set, it's usually in a spreadsheet, or it's somewhere put together in numbers. When I, or when a lot of my colleagues doing the similar things go into their research, our data set is usually not existing. So we have to extract everything we can in terms of data from these kind of situations that you see here on the screen. Complex interrelations between settlements, infrastructure, agriculture, in the case of Addis Ababa. And so it's almost impossible, as Edgar Peterson says, to think just simply in simple categories, and that we have to be very reflexive and careful about how we go about these things in today's urbanization patterns and cities. One thing could be, of course, that we would say, okay, let's allow everything and anything goes. You know this phrase probably from The Godfather of Anything Goes, from Paul Feyerabend. And if you look at what happens on the ground, you really think sometimes that anything goes. This is an image of things that you see on an everyday basis in Addis Ababa. Mud huts being replaced or adjacent to newly built buildings, seemingly uncoordinated, and sometimes really not explainable through just common ideas of how to research these things. But what Paul Feyerabend says in his book Against Method, Outline for Anarchistic Theory of Knowledge, he, of course, the anything goes is a provocation. Of course, there's kind of a certain way to go about it. He rather says that he wants to convince people that that all methodology, even the most obvious ones, have their limits. And sometimes I realize when I present my research to, let's say, social scientists or sociologists or geographers, for example, they were often very strict in their methodologies and couldn't kind of see what I'm doing or what I do, or accept the kind of deviations I took from some of their methodologies that they used to apply. This is especially the case for qualitative research, where we ask questions. When you see something like this again in Addis Ababa, we have to be able to make qualitative assumptions and assessments. In this case, just what's shabby, what's chic, witness the transformation. Are you really a witness, or is it a post on you? So there's a lot of qualitative aspects that go beyond the pure data and pure, also sometimes sociological aspects, especially if it's about the built environment. So I would argue for these kind of research questions and research endeavors, there's this very strong case to be made for what Ben Fleberg calls narrative inquiries, where we can start an investigation from a particular phenomenon on the ground and start from there and walk our way through different methods and methodologies to get to the gist of things. One of the basic methodologies to do qualitative research is, of course, case study. And as you can see in the title of my dissertation, this is the way I went. Case study research, in this case, in my case, we call this is a picture I took, the international beautification of Addis Ababa. So I was investigating the case study of international development cooperation projects and how they change, transform the city on a spatial and social base level. And the case study, I think, is a very interesting framework. As here James Dumney, Nancy Odendahl, and Vanessa Watson say, it allows to really analyze a sort of complexity of interrelations, and you can mix in power relations, material, in our case, spatial formation, political issues, economic issues, social issues. And apart from that, from this point of view, I did something what I call the explorative bottom-up trajectory, which feeds into what I already said. If you face something like this, a newly built highway in the middle of the city with cows on it, that was my bottom-up point. This is where I started basically my research. You look at something, you start to ask yourself, why is that? You maybe don't ask yourself, how can you get the cows away out of UA? But I think sometimes for these issues, it's important to take a step back and really start to question the question before that. So why is that there? Why does it need a highway at all, maybe, or why are the cows there? How can they be accommodated? And again, from the same authors, the case study approach kind of allows this approach to intersect these everyday practices, everyday happenings on the ground, and then work one's way through the different policies and theories, etc. So my research basically started with this. These are all pictures I took on my first trip to Addis, which I did with a group of students at ETH. They had to do their field research. I had time to just look at the city. You can see on the left-hand side, that's the Addis Ababa Hilton Hotel, which was at the time one of the only places or two places where there was a stable ATM. So we had to go there very often. And what I realized there is that at one day when I got my cash, the hotel was full of German engineers and architects in the Hilton Hotel. And I saw that they were in some kind of conference. I realized later that you will see that they were all there for a huge housing program and capacity development program that the Ethiopian government started with the Germans. The second image is taken at the biggest market in Addis, the Mercato district, where I wanted to buy, as a responsible tourist, I wanted to buy the classical Ethiopian coffee cups made out of ceramics. I couldn't find coffee cups made in Ethiopia, but only made in China. So very similar to the shoes you see here. And on the right-hand side, we went to see the highly regarded and very new fancy Dutch embassy. With the students, and I was wondering why are the Dutch interested in doing that? Why are they placing themselves there? And one of the main reasons you can see in the forefront, it's the roses. Ethiopia has become one of the biggest rose and flower exporters in Africa during the past 20 years. This basically led over some iterations, of course, to my case studies that I analyzed in my PhD. Case study one is the social housing project, and got done with official development cooperation agency from Germany. Case study two led, so the reasons why the Chinese were flooding the Ethiopian market had other ramifications, namely that they were very much involved or have been started to be involved in infrastructure construction in Ethiopia, but also in Addis. So the first Chinese financed road in Ethiopia was the so-called Ring Road, and it was built by a Chinese company and financed partially by China. So it's a different actor there from the outside. The third case study was related to the flowers, the export agriculture, which is a kind of, I would say, a very urban agriculture. It's very dependent on the urban hub. Flowers have to be flown out every day through the airport to be freshly delivered to the Netherlands. And there, the kind of development agent wasn't a big country like China or a conglomerate of official development cooperation actors in Germany, but private companies who were lured or driven into Ethiopia to invest their businesses. I looked at all these case studies from a descriptive perspective. I looked at the historical framework of each of these topics of housing and road infrastructure and export agriculture. I then investigated what you see in the second level, the kind of case studies in development in a time frame of about 15 years. They all happened in the same time frame. So just descriptively describing, this is where it started, and this happened, this happened. Then I had this analytical layer, which I developed which I kind of put into three different categories. There's the mode of cooperation, so the classical north-south thing with the Germans, then the so-called south-south cooperation with the Chinese, and what I call market-led development with the private actors. I looked into the financial models because all of these models had a very strong relationship to how it's financed, and this financing had a lot to do with then how things were built. That was what I looked at, the typology. So all of these three case studies produced a very specific typology that has not existed in this form or at this mass before in Ethiopia. So here you can see this again, North-South cooperation and the financial models. I will go into this a little bit later, and the typologies. And on top of that, I had sort of a reflective layer where I looked at these things always from these perspectives of, you know, what is a global and local aspects, what are private and public actors. And for me as a designer interested in the outcome is, so was the spatial outcome driven by some kind of linear fast track procedure just to do things? Or was there also some qualitative aspect to make things actually good? And this is kind of reflected in my the contents, table of contents of my PhD. So all this is a very kind of very structured setup where every case study is basically looked at through the same lenses, although they are very kind of diverse in nature. So the research, Ethiopia, there's kind of a lot of reasons why I ended up in Ethiopia. It has a lot to do with my former boss, where I worked at ETH, but we were involved for a lot of years with Ethiopia. We had a lot of friends and guests coming from Ethiopia to our school to teach, also exchange students, etc. That's why I ended up in Addis for these 2 weeks, where I saw all these things that led to my case studies. But Ethiopia is a very specific case in Africa because it has never actually been colonized. It has been occupied by the Italians during Mussolini's regime in the Second World War, but for 6 years they could. I mean, it's kind of frightening what they could do in 6 years, but you know, Ethiopia kind of lacks this typical colonial structures that you find in other African countries. And it was very dominated. It's very dominated by its leaders. So Addis Ababa was founded by Menelik II, the first emperor of the big kind of then called Abyssinia, the Ethiopian East African horn of Africa. He founded Addis Ababa in 1884, I think, and he was followed by Haile Selassie, who was maybe known to many of you as this well-known world-traveling king, independent king at this time, because they were in the colony. So he was one of the only African leaders who kind of wasn't colonialized, right? So on his own feet. He was overthrown by Mengistu Haile Mariam, who installed a brutal military regime that lasted 15 years. And he again was overthrown by the Liberation Army originating in the north of Ethiopia, with their leader Meles Zenawi, who became the prime minister also for a very long time. He died in office in 2012 and has been since replaced by three other people, but who are still in the same party. And so everything that I'm going to talk about happens basically in Meles Zenawi's time, when they took over and wanted to bring Ethiopia to the next age. Ethiopia, as you can see, is huge. It has about 95 million inhabitants, second largest in terms of population in Africa. It overtook Egypt and is second to Nigeria. It's very rural still. Addis Ababa is its main urban center. You can see it, the pink spot in the middle of the country. It's in the highland. And Addis Ababa has been one of the fastest growing cities. That's also one of the reasons why I was interested in, or we were looking at Addis, one of the fastest growing cities for a couple of years or almost a decade in Africa in terms of rates. So it went from, it doubled its size from 1.5 million to 3 million within 10 years. And now it's even more. Nobody really knows actually. Here you can see the spatial ramifications of this. So it was kind of slow until in the 70s, mid 70s, but then it kind of exploded and it started to take over the hinterland. You see the municipality is kind of the dotted line, and it has started to begin spreading into its neighbor regions. And apart from this, and that's why I focused on development cooperation, although it wasn't colonized, I argue in my research as a conclusion that these kind of setups for development cooperation coming from different areas, starting mainly from the Western world in the 50s after the Second World War, kind of tied Ethiopia into this development mode. You know, suddenly Ethiopia was underdeveloped, like a lot of other countries, which of course is up to debate what that means. But in this system, that meant that Ethiopia was kind of part of this developmental framework, and up till today. And this has influenced a lot of things, how they happen in Ethiopia. And you can see here the three documents are so-called sustainable, are these national, hugely ambitious development plans put in by Meles Zenawi when he took power in the mid-90s, that are all tied back in some ways to, so all my three case studies are some part of these development programs. So there's a big frameworks, 5-year programs, what they develop. They want to develop schools, education, industry, etc. So the first case study, social housing, it's called the Integrated Housing Development Program. It was meant to be integrated, that meaning, you know, it should also create jobs and industry and knowledge and little micro enterprises. The shortage was about 300 units, which is a big underestimation. At this time, they weren't, in the end, of course, able to build so many houses, because that was, I mean, even though what they did was unprecedented in terms of Addis Ababa's housing history, it had never happened to build so many units. It's still ongoing, and it was, like I said, done together with the German official, the governmental development agency of Germany, the GTZ. Now it's called GIS. So North-South cooperation, which means it's embedded in this framework that you probably know, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. There's this whole framework installed after World War II that has developed a lot of ideas and frameworks, but also ideologies. What development means. You can see some of these things on the left-hand side. You know, this technical assistance, it was called beforehand. Now it was called capacity building, helping these so-called underdeveloped countries to get to another level of development. Then in the case of housing, home ownership was a very strong ideological string through all the years and documents, and also related to if you get money or not. You have to install home ownership, and economic growth as a given. That is just the way it is. Everything that you have to do has to kind of accommodate economic growth. More recently, ideally, pro-poor policies mean that, you know, growth should benefit the poor as well. Mortgages, you all know what that is. For the housing program, they installed for the first time mortgages at this big scale that wasn't existing beforehand. So they kind of implemented a whole new system of finance into the country. And related to housing units that they created and built to different mortgage schemes that, you know, wasn't there before this program. So a lot of people, you can see the lower part that you hardly can see is the list that I obtained from the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, who was the main mortgage lender. It's this huge list of new indebtors for the new housing program that didn't exist yet, but now are part of this whole debt cycle. Housing blocks were designed, standardized housing blocks. You will see later, very standardized. You will recognize them immediately. So there wasn't a very fast pace. There wasn't kind of an idea of like adapting local traditions or local cultures was not part of the game. This was one reason for the the mortgage system. The bank wouldn't allow to have, for example, incremental building systems because you need a finished kind of standardized housing unit as a collateral, etc. So this was all kind of interlocked. So from the ideology of home ownership to the mortgage to the typology, this kind of things working hand in hand. As I said, new laws had to be established on the left-hand side. There wasn't something like a condominium ownership system, so they had to install that, the condominium law, so that you can own a unit within a multifamily house. And a lot of manuals developed by the GTZ, by this development agency, how to, this is the part of the capacity building to keep the knowledge there, so that you could basically hand over theoretically the manual, and then, you know, Ethiopians can do it with it, what they can do it for themselves. This is a map where you see that in red, these housing sites. The problem was in the beginning, they wanted to replace so-called slum dwellings in the center of the city, which didn't work very well because there was a lot of resistance from the local people, and what they actually initially wanted to do, namely densifying the center, didn't happen. So with the pace that they were given, they had to kind of deviate to the outskirts of the city and start implementing all the amounts of units that they were asked to build somewhere, as you can see, the big sites, the big red dots, somewhere in out of nowhere, in the nowhere, with no access to streets and public transport at these times. And this is just a little collection. I mean, that's a couple of years old. Nowadays, you find them even more and everywhere. That's, for me, it was a good thing to have these standardized housing blocks because I could identify them right away. So, but on the ground, you will see it created some kind of not a lot of diversity, as you can imagine. They were built, as I said, in the periphery, so farming land was taken over with these housing units. And this is one in the middle of the city where they could kind of install one of these estates within the city. And this is the first generation. You can see typical things, what you could see everywhere in almost every spot, that they didn't have money or investment into the outdoor spaces. Main focus was just building these houses. Sometimes even sewage was not there. People use the outdoor spaces for other things than they were intended to. Another thing, very important, almost every Ethiopian household has a so-called traditional kitchen, which means a fireplace where you can do your traditional meals. Middle-class families, for example, I mean, have this as well. They often have a house and then in the backyard an open fireplace where somebody's cooking things on the open fire. So here you can see, for some reason, they thought they would install a kind of traditional European kitchen into these houses, which many people didn't use when they came in these houses. And they started to use the access balconies for the outdoor kitchen. As you can see here, this little cone here is a little oven. The toilets, again, an issue. For some reason, the whole estates were installed with toilets that weren't sometimes connected to a decent sewage system. So it was this kind of image of this housing block with all its amenities, through this financial model that kind of passed by a lot of cultural things and issues. Apart from that, many people couldn't afford to live there, so the houses were distributed via lottery. So you could be lucky to be winner of a lottery ticket, but oftentimes people couldn't even afford the down payment of the unit, so they had to take a little extra microcredit to pay for the down payment and then to get into the mortgage. So two debts at the same time, or the whole family had to put money together to finance one down payment. And oftentimes a lot of people didn't even move in. For the people who were intended to be living in there, they moved out, went back into more lower standard houses and rented this out to the middle class, who's kind of taking over all these estates. So kind of not achieving one of the main goals, basically to house the poorest parts of society. Second case study is the road infrastructure. Like I said, I was focusing on the ring road, which was one of the first roads constructed by Chinese companies by a Chinese company in Ethiopia. It was kind of a trailblazer because since then Chinese construction and business has taken a lot of sectors over in Addis and in Ethiopia. It was partially financed by a Chinese loan, and I also looked at an interchange that you can see here. I won't talk about it today because of time issues. But basically, this was also a mix of the Ethiopian, of the Addis Ababa Roads Authority with the Chinese actors, plus a British engineer who was in the beginning responsible for the design of the ring road. Again, this is the framework of the South-South cooperation. I will talk about this right away. Then the financing scheme is usually this huge credits, concessional loans and grants that the Chinese started to imitate to a certain degree. So similar to what the official Western development framework with the World Bank is doing. And the Chinese have started heavily to kind of install their own financing schemes and financing institutions. And the resulting typology in this case is the urban highway, which in this way hasn't existed before in Addis Ababa. So South-South cooperation is what China calls, how China defines it, is very strongly based on the different also leaders of the Communist Party. One of the reasons why China is so strong in Africa, I don't know how much you're aware of that or you're interested in this, but Communist China, after the Chinese Revolution, the Chinese government had to go to exile to Taiwan, and the Communist Party basically stayed on the mainland. But in the newly founded United Nations, the rest of the world didn't accept Communist China as China, so they accepted Taiwan as the official representative of China, which was, of course, for the Chinese government on the mainland not the ideal thing. So they over the years started to lobby and make sure that they become the official representative in the United Nations and not Taiwan. And one of their main focus was Africa. So they started to already help and do their own kind of development frameworks in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and trying to kind of gain the confidence and the trust of a lot of African countries. And in the end, as you can see in the year of 71, with the big help of a lot of African votes, Communist China was replaced as the official China in the United Nations. On the bottom, you see this financial system that they installed in terms of development. They started to with the opening up policies in the late 80s. They started to encourage companies to go outside of China, heavily subsidized, and helped with loans from state banks to go out into the world and develop and find work. And how this works, so they installed the Exim Bank, you can see on the upper right hand side, which is basically the Chinese sort of World Bank. They finance a lot of projects, and how this works, it's called, this kind of called the on the right hand side, issuing these loans through the Chinese system. It's called some scholars who investigated in more depth called it the Angola mode, which basically means if you're borrowing government, you can see on the left-hand side, in this case Ethiopia, you apply for a loan. You want to build a street, you apply for a loan at the Chinese Exim Bank on the right-hand side. Then the Chinese Exim Bank, because it's owned by the government, it's basically one ecosystem. They go to the Chinese government, the Ministry of Commerce, and see if that's kind of a possible thing. If they say yes, the Chinese government signs an agreement, a framework agreement with the government. So it's very high level between governments. Once this is signed, the Exim Bank releases the money. But usually in these framework agreements, it usually says that, you know, the money or the way it works is that you need a Chinese contractor, a Chinese company who does the work. So the money basically never leaves the Chinese side. It always stays on the Chinese side. And in this case, the Ethiopian government gets a street, but it's paid by China for a Chinese contractor. So that's basically the Angola mode that the Chinese government applies almost all over Africa and also in other regions. And down on the right-hand side, you see the importance of China growing for Ethiopia with China. So China has become the main import partner for Ethiopia in a very, very quick amount of time. So the urban highway, on the typology side, you know, there's also a lot of different reasons how and why a road is designed how it is. In this case, it was a very typical kind of process of in this case, a UK engineering office working together with the government to produce the cheapest, quickest way to build this road. Since the Chinese were giving the money, there's always a very tight time frame to these projects, so it had to happen very quickly. No regards for the context, basically. I mean, that's kind of the summary I could make. It's an at-grade street. You can see on the top there's a schematic design which basically didn't change. It's a fast lane in the middle. The two middle lanes are fast lanes, and on the right-hand side is our access roads, which means you can't cross the street. You need an overpass basically to cross the street as a pedestrian. And these schemes you can trace. I could trace them back very directly to the basic way how these are designed to these kind of documents that you can see on the right hand side, these manuals. I mean, American highway system is one of the main references till today, how highways are designed. In some cases, as you can see on the top, obviously is road node. Some agencies started to try to adapt this to kind of rural roads in Africa or Asia. But for the kind of urban situation, there wasn't a lot of kind of adaptation to the circumstances. So there was this bias again. Of course, you know, initially Africa was supposed to be an agricultural land, so the main focus was on this rural, in between city roads over land roads. But now the focus on what could it mean, or what does it mean to install a highway in an African city. So they kind of took things from, you can trace these back, these kind of typologies of roads back to some of these manuals of this ring road, or how the ring road is designed. So this, you can see these are phases 1 and 2. The dotted line is not built. I think they're a little bit further now, but not finished yet. They came into trouble with the locals again for the last part of the ring road. And here you can see, starting on the left-hand corner where they actually started building it, and going from left to right to the end on the very bottom right, where it's still, well, they're a little bit further than that now, but not finished yet. But what you can see is basically introducing a total new typology and scale into the city, in a city where basically, 99% are pedestrians and don't own a car. It did connect, very importantly, certain areas of the city, which beforehand were notoriously congested, or you couldn't go there. You had to move through the whole city. Had to go there. So here you can see that's the end for now, where the road stops. And here you can see the ramifications of this schematic design that is just extruded basically wherever it goes. There's no change, no adaptation to the neighborhoods. This, you can see I took this picture on a pedestrian overpass. You don't see the next one somewhere. So, if you're pedestrian, you're probably more likely just cross it illegally, and that's actually what a lot of people do. A lot of injuries and deaths on the street since it was built. Here is, of course, kind of marriage of the two projects, of the housing project and the ring road. Sometimes you have the whole thing going into a roundabout, so like 4 lanes into one roundabout. It cuts off, like the previous image, whole neighborhood. So here you can see in the back of where I stand, there's basically the other part of this neighborhood that you see in front of you. So it's like, and I talked to people there that was basically one neighborhood just cut apart. And of course, the image that I showed you already, no kind of recognition of issues that are there, whether you like it or not. Animals are part of the city. They probably will be for the next decades, because it's still a rural, mainly rural country. People come from the countryside. They sell their cattle in the city. And here, a place where it started to, because of some density around it, started to kind of have some adequacy, maybe in terms of scale and how people use it. The third and last case study is the export agriculture, the flower farms, which I already said has been pushed very strongly by the Ethiopian government because it's a so-called cash crop. So there's a lot of, it's just made for export. Ethiopians don't buy roses from there. It's just made to be exported, and it brings in foreign currency. And it's done mainly through private companies. I called it market-led cooperation because there still has to be some cooperation framework, because there were a lot of frameworks and deals made to make this happen. This usually goes under the idea of foreign direct investment. As I said, the company comes, invests money, creates officially jobs. And in the case of the typology, it created this new vast typology of the plastic greenhouse. This is what I mean with the framework. There's, in the case of Ethiopia, there was an early agreement with the Dutch government, because the Dutch obviously are the experts in flower growing, and they realized Ethiopia's highlands are supposedly ideal to grow roses at an unbeatable price. And so they set up this thing where you create tax incentives for the companies. They don't pay taxes in the beginning. They get supposedly easy access to farmland, which is of course often a contested issue. Foreign direct investment, of course, is, even though it invests, it also funnels out money again, because you have a parent company that usually is not part of the company of the country. So this whole model of these branch and subsidiaries who go into a country officially, of course, create jobs. In this case, these are case, is at the very, very lowest end. It's $1 per hour, $1 per day jobs for mainly women in the field who become for the first time employees, which is also not so easy for a lot of people. But it's not that they create kind of a high-end or a sophisticated job environment. Also, a very kind of pattern that emerges and comes back and forth again with all these issues is what you can see on the lower parts, the dark gray. It is a distribution of costs. How many percentages of the cost do these different elements need? And as you can see, like basically everything that is local in Ethiopia is in the very low percentages. So, for example, the royalties for planting seeds at the top row you see is 7.4% of the whole process. The plastic material for the plastic houses is 80% of the cost, whereas 2% is only spent for labor. And the plastic material, of course, doesn't come from Ethiopia. So like the 70% are earned by somebody else, not the Ethiopians. There's this very cheap, very traditional, straightforward green plastic house. I mean, you could call it almost already traditional or a vernacular structure that is seen all over the world. Again, a lot of laws, especially in terms of land aggregation, which caused a lot of issues. I can't go too much into it, but I mean, there's a lot of questions, of course, regarding to land grabbing and how the lands kind of changed hands. It's all government-owned land, so it's in charge of, the government is in charge of it, but the way they kind of make these deals are mostly favorable for the investors and not for the local population. Again, a lot of handbooks and manuals how to do that. If you want to start a flower business, you can go to this handbook and see what you have to do. They are all located on this main axis. Again, this is also where these case studies somehow come together, because a lot of these axes are now kind of built out and improved by Chinese contractors and Chinese money. So enabled to ship these flowers very quickly to the center, to the Addis Ababa airport. And these are these different flower farms emerging along these roads. You can see how quickly they start to take over these certain areas. Here you see how quick this is, because only half of it is, taken a picture of from the satellite. And they introduce, of course, I mean, yeah, this new thing where the agricultural land that is usually very customary, the way it's used and owned, creates this appropriation basically for this industrial production for the flowers that go somewhere else. And this kind of the juxtaposition of this, how, looking out from one of these greenhouses into the farmland, and the assembly hall where they pack it and rows that might end up at your wedding. So again, this is basically it. Just as a last comment, to come back to this question of how to investigate these things. For like everything that you saw had to do with a lot of different methods and methodologies, especially in contexts like that, where you can't kind of rely on data sets, etc. You have to triangulate a lot of times. you don't have access to everything, so you have to kind of find your way through and kind of be more almost like a detective sometimes. Use different methods, expert interviews to just kind of verify certain things. And these are, I will finish with two images. I start with a couple of images which kind of represent for me this kind of thing. This is an image I took also on my first trip, where you can really kind of put all bad intentions in interpreting this kind of advertisement. It's this kind of African dark fist seamlessly connected to this Western technology of the tire that really literally plows through the African soil. Where I think this kind of represents often kind of a linear and simplification of things, how things run. You can do that, you can investigate this way, but I'm much more interested in this kind of mix of ambiguity, where you see in daily practices also what people do and how things work is sometimes not as clearly defined as the former image might suggest, but this kind of way how, in this case, you could imagine that this car is both, I don't know what it is, basically, if it still belongs to the Netherlands or not, or if you could still drive it in the Netherlands. It's kind of a hybrid mode of doing things. And for this kind of research, I experienced that you have to kind of benefits you have to go into this uncertain territory sometimes to get some answers. So, and that was it.
Hey, yeah, great.
Thanks
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes left. So if we have any of you,
I can stay like 10-15 more minutes if that helps.
Okay, sure.
Nobody has to leave. So
okay, so
students have to wait a little bit, but that's okay.
Sure, thank you. So to the audience, if you have any question, please ask a question to Dr. Delz directly. Any questions? Oh, yes, Mark.
Number one, very, very, very interesting and very careful work. I want to compliment you, Sascha. I think it was very well done. I like the historical background and then what you ran through. The downside is it's terribly bleak. It's just so, we know this doesn't work and this doesn't work and this doesn't work. And to fix things, you have to start by knowing what's not working. But I was wondering whether you had any ideas about how even some small part of this would work better.
I mean, that's yeah, thank you very much for this question. That's an obvious question. I don't know. I mean, I didn't go too much into that today. I mean, I had some kind of provocative through this when I kind of synthesized it in my conclusion. I have some kind of proposals how this could work in a different way. But on the ground, you see, the interesting thing is that it's not, it's also the way I try to do it, because also, obviously I'm not an Ethiopian. So that there's, I had to work through a lot of, having a kind of critical distance and being sensitive and kind of appropriately involved in this process. But what you realize is that when you're there and look all through these things and you talk to people, it's that the what you call maybe the bleakness is not, it's not just imposed. It's oftentimes part, it's kind of a partners in crime, kind of scenario where there's suddenly certain elements of the society start to profit from things. And there's, I mean, for this kind of thing, I mean, at least I think, there's some kind of ownership from there's an ownership from the Ethiopian side where you can say, okay, if that's what they want, that's what they do. You know, you can't kind of patronize that, right? But of course, there's on the ground. I think I realized there's a lot of pushback from civil society, especially. I mean, the land grabbing is a big issue, and then the housing. Housing is also an issue because, as I said, you know, it didn't serve the original intended demography. So there were a lot of, there's some aspects. It's also very political, depending on who's in power. You have like a 4-year window to question things, but then before election, you can't do that anymore for a couple of years, or 1 year, and then you can go on again. But I mean, for example, what I found interesting is a colleague of mine who got a house unit in one of these condominium houses. They realized, you know, it's not working. You know, the whole services, outdoor spaces, everybody just parks everywhere. Trash is not taken care of, etc. They started, for example, a cooperative that maintains the whole thing. So everybody who lives there has to pay a little fee, becomes part of the cooperative, and then with this money, they started to kind of take care of the outdoor spaces and like having some local people who take care about the parking and taking out the trash. So improving these areas, and I think, you know, for a certain degree or certain kind of lifestyle, it starts to work. It just took like 10 years of adjustment to make it work for a certain amount of people, not everyone. And the Chinese are just, you know, the Chinese are very hard to reject. I mean, they are everywhere. They have a lot of money. They jumped into a gap. The World Bank stopped at some point to give money for actual projects. They started to give money for governance issues and structures and things like that. So the Chinese kind of jumped into this gap and started to go on with the money, and which made them, yeah, until today almost irreplaceable.
Which is probably
I think
a part of
sorry?
Probably a part of what their intention was.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And they're very business oriented. It's not just about natural resources. Ethiopia doesn't have natural resources. Ethiopia is a big market, you know, that is enough to be investing there. And geopolitically important because the seat of the African Union is in Addis. So, you know, it's kind of different reasons why they're interested in Ethiopia.
Okay. Great.
And finally, maybe just is another question, maybe?
Any other questions from audience? No. Actually, I have a question. So I have a question. Yeah, as an associate dean for research. So I think I can see the many research parameters that are from other disciplines, so out of architecture, and such as economics and public policy and others. So yes, as you know, multidisciplinary research has become a significant trend in the research domain. So yeah, to make such a research activity, to make such a research very active in the School of Architecture, in our school. So can you suggest any idea to what we should do, or what we should have in the school level? Do you have any suggestion?
Oh, to how to pursue or push multidisciplinary research?
Yeah, how to motivate some multidisciplinary research like yours. So for in general, to faculty and school and then student at the school level.
I mean, it depends on are you talking about research in general or PhD research?
Research in general.
Okay. I mean, for me, my experience is that well, at the stage I was, or at the time I did it, it was very much dependent on personalities, on people who kind of were willing to engage with that or not. So I think it's kind of a cultural thing to kind of, you know, talk to people and see, or kind of find the people who would be interested in giving up a little bit of their domain in order to contribute to the common thing, because you know, I also had to give up some of my domain, you know, to be able to do that. And also, yeah, like I said, the kind of methodological level is, I think, the most challenging part, because depending on from which discipline you come and how long you've been involved in it, it becomes very kind of, it's your world, right? And understandably so. But I mean, in my case, I you know, I found a couple of people, not even at my university, who were willing to exchange at a level that was helpful, not being just rejected, or not just like facing totally not understanding what I'm doing, basically. So I don't know. I mean, it's probably, we would have to see if it's for the School of Architecture. I mean, it's important to see what everybody's doing in terms of research. What is their expertise? What kind of background do they have? And maybe, I think for me, it's also, I mean, not now in research, but I did some workshops with interdisciplinary workshops with engineers, with sociologists, with architects, with urban planners, students. And what was always very helpful is to have kind of a common project that you work on to establish kind of something that everybody can have a little piece of and contribute. And also then through this process starts to be challenged by the other disciplines and other people. So in our case, it was a little design challenge, of course, because you know, I was interested in this applying some design solutions to how we could all like change the ring road, for example. That was the topic of the workshop, how to transform it to make it more accessible. But the common project, I think, is important. So maybe we have to look for research projects that embrace these different modes and different disciplines, where you know, maybe not everybody has to agree on everything, how it's done, but that there's like a little, at least some common denominator where everybody can contribute. Right. So, I mean, for me, I would be very much interested in, you know, like all the technological issues, topics, how they come into more the social space and vice versa. So if there's kind of a project that covers all of that, that's, in my experience, helpful. Also to get people motivated.
Sure.
So it's not the research design, basically, I think, could attract people to do it. Not, you know, if you start to establish the project itself as kind of a cross-disciplinary thing already, that would help.
Oh, right. So actually, I know that recently National Science Foundation, they launched community-based research program very seriously, and so let me type over here in the chat window. So why don't you have a look at the program? So it has a multi-program available this year. So I believe it will be helpful for your research. Okay. So any other question from the audience? Okay, so yeah, so let me.
Thank you for joining.
Oh yeah, sure. So yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, and it's
Thank
really.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was able to learn very other perspective to understand the urban design.
Great, I'm very glad to hear that.
I wish we could have lunch on campus. I have a dozen other questions. I had a student, a graduate student from Eritrea.
Oh, yeah.
Dove into that 30 years ago when I had him, and it's very interesting to see what's going on now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah,
Okay.
sometime in the future, we will be able to have that lunch,
Sure.
right? As long as everybody stays safe. Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Okay. Thank you
Thank
again,
you.
Sascha. And
You.
yes, thank you to all the audience for attending this seminar. So as I announced earlier, so we will have a fourth seminar on October 19th by inviting Dr. Erika Cochran, the director of Center for Building Performance and Diagnostics at the Carnegie Mellon University. So hope to see you at the next seminar hall. Okay. So thank you very much to all, and then have a nice rest of the day. Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.